Buonasera, benvenuti. Io sono molto contento e anche impaziente di dare avvio con questa conferenza al ciclo di incontri dedicati a questa, lasciatemelo dire, bellissima mostra su Memling che ha aperto le scuole del Quirinale, e con, come è giusto che sia, con il curatore della mostra, che è Till-Holger Borchert. Sono contento di presentarlo e di presentarvelo. Devo dirlo, uno dei curatori con cui è stato più piacevole ed efficace, fruttuoso lavorare in un periodo di tempo lungo, ma non abbastanza lungo da fare le cose con calma. Quindi ecco, senza il suo aiuto, senza la sua competenza e la sua dimestichezza con il complicato sistema museale internazionale, diciamo, questa impresa veramente questa sfida non sarebbe stata certamente realizzata. Il ciclo di conferenze è un ciclo di conferenze che insiste molto sul tema del rapporto di Memling con l'Italia, tema per il quale anche la mostra ha molti momenti di riflessione. Si tratta di una mostra monografica, credo che molti di voi l'abbiano già vista, una mostra monografica, ma all'interno di questo carattere complessivo il taglio curatoriale ha saputo dare un indirizzo molto preciso, che è stato anche l'indirizzo per cui è stato facile anche ottenere i prestiti, perché bene o male tutti i prestatori hanno aderito a questa formulazione speciale della mostra, appunto dedicata a questo decisivo momento di comunicazione culturale che c'è in Europa alla fine del Quattrocento, nel rapporto meridione e settentrione d'Europa, e particolarmente Fiandre e Italia, rapporto per il quale Memling fu un elemento decisivo, sia diciamo in un senso nord-sud, cioè lavorando egli stesso per molti committenti italiani, questo lo vediamo in mostra molto chiaramente, ma anche da un punto di vista inverso, perché rappresentò uno degli elementi di fascinazione più forti, più evidenti per gli artisti italiani che videro le sue opere una volta in Italia. In questo senso, dunque, l'insistenza delle conferenze su questo tema è servita proprio a esaltare questo aspetto. Avremo la conferenza di Federica Veratelli, che è una degli autori del catalogo, che è dedicata allo studio delle appassionanti storie delle persone, cioè dei committenti, dei banchieri, dei mercanti italiani attivi a Bruges relazionati con Memling. Sarà una conferenza molto piena, diciamo, di narrativa, di aneddotica molto interessante. Avremo la conferenza di Giovanni Villa, il nostro Giovanni Villa, autore curatore di molte delle mostre dedicate all'arte veneta fra 400 e 500 alle scuderie del Quirinale, in particolare coinvolto come co-curatore nella mostra su Antonello da Messina, che è la figura, come dire, un po' l'alter ego, il contrappeso italiano della storia di Memling. Quindi sarà molto interessante studiare questo. Ci sarà Francesca Cappelletti, che è studiosa del paesaggio nella pittura fiamminga, che cercherà di capire proprio da questo punto di vista in che misura la modernità di Memling insiste sul suo successo italiano. E ci sarà per finire anche questa conferenza un po' bizzarra, ma con un paradosso un po' acrobatico l'associazione un po' acrobatica fra Matisse e Memling, che servirà effettivamente da una parte a far capire come nel mondo, nella congerie della modernità novecentesca, il rapporto con il mondo della rappresentazione del tardo Quattrocento fiammingo, in particolare con la decorazione, il sistema decorativo di Memling, fosse importante per questi artisti, ma in più servirà anche da volano per la mostra successiva, che come sapete sarà dedicata a Matisse e si aprirà a marzo alle scuole del Quirinale. Detto questo, lascio ovviamente la parola a Till Borchert, che ci presenterà questa conferenza, ovviamente dedicata, diciamo, ai temi generali della mostra, ma, diciamo, da qualsiasi punto di vista lui parla sarà sempre, come dire, attinente alle ragioni che hanno presieduto alla definizione del progetto. Buon ascolto, grazie.
Grazie Matteo. Buonasera, io parlo in inglese stasera. The white noise in your heads have stopped, which is good. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight and to talk about the exhibition Memling, the Flemish Renaissance, which we have mounted in the Scuderia di Quirinale. In many ways it feels like taking owls to Athens, bringing back a painter that has been very popular in Italy, at least in the 15th century, and if we look at collection history, there are 3 countries where today I think you can have a nice overview on Memling paintings, the one being Belgium or maybe soon Flanders, the other one being the United States, where of course many collectors in the 19th and early 20th century have thrown lots of money on the market to buy whatever was possible, and so as a result there are fantastic paintings in the American museums and Italy, where there is, I think, a very substantial collection of early Netherlandish painting in Memling in particular. So the subject of today is I'm trying to broaden a little bit what we have done in the exhibition. Of course, an exhibition is always restricted by practicalities, and the advantage of books, other than nobody reads them, is that you can expand your subject. This is what I'm going to do. And you, if you have visited the exhibition, then you see that we are trying to make a point that Memling is sort of like coming out of the Cologne school. I'm sure that probably not many of you are aware of the intrinsic qualities of Cologne painting, characterized by a painter called Stefan Lochner, who in around 1430s and the 1440s was painting a monumental altarpiece, influenced largely by early Netherlandish painting called the altarpiece of the Three Magi, which was commissioned for the city's town hall, depicting all the patron saints of the city, and is now in the Cathedral of Cologne. It's a painting where you, as you can see, where you can see a lot of reflections, which became the trademark also of Netherlandish painting. And to give you a little bit of an idea of the intrinsic quality of Lochner's painting, so the painting in Cologne around 1450, I show you a little painting in the Gulbenkian collection in Lisbon, where you see, for example, this shadow. There's a lot of already Netherlandish material in there. I have, and others have argued that Memling, who was born in Germany, after a first training in Cologne, went probably to the Netherlands, where he might have entered the workshop of Rogier van der Weyden himself, not an unknown person in Italy, because he was traveling to Italy in 1450 on the Holy Year. He went to Rome. He had connections to the court of Ferrara and painted for Ludovico d'Este. I show you here a triptych made for the Castilian kings of the baptism of Christ, which is today in the Gemäldegallery in Berlin. And of course, Rogier van der Weyden was an extremely influential artist, had a lot of spin-offs, if you want to. A painter called the Master of the St. Catherine legend, probably Peter van der Weyden, painted a triptych which was basically based on a Rogier composition, and as you probably will recall, two of these panels are actually in the exhibition here, the middle panel being in a church in Switzerland. The other enigmatic follower of Rogier van der Weyden is a painter we know from documents called Franke van der Stok. There's a whole controversy if he is one of the major followers of Rogier van der Weyden or not. Fact is, he is documented in Brussels, and we know that works of his were exported early on to Spain. This triptych of the Last Judgment was actually sold by merchants to the city of Valencia, and it is a composition that reflects knowledge of both Rogier van der Weyden and Dirk Bouts, and so therefore gives you an idea about a contemporary of Memling who kind of went through the same influences to give you an idea what the specific qualities of that master are. Of course, this composition is based on Rogier's Last Judgment, polyptych in Beaune, made in 1445, one of the great altarpieces still in situ, still in the Hotel Dieu in Beaune. If you happen to pass by, it's worthwhile because they have one of the best red wines in the area. And probably the most influential composition of Rogier van der Weyden was the so-called Triptych of the Epiphany Columba altarpiece, made for the church of Saint Columba in Cologne, made for presumably for the Wasserfass family, which is now kept in the Alte Pinakothek in München, which inspired Memling several times to his own interpretation of the subject, as I show you here, the Triptych of Jan Florens from 1479 from the Hospital Museum in Bruges. In 1465, Memling arrived in Bruges, and I show you here two images, one by the master of the St. Lucia legend on your left, and an illustration from the Chronicles of Jean Froissart from a manuscript in the Bibliothek of Berlin. That gives you an idea, sort of, that in the 15th century, Bruges was a very substantial town. It was a large town. It had almost as many inhabitants as London at that period, and it was very, very important. Trade flourished. As you can see, this is a miniature attributed to one of the Burgundian illuminators, Jean le Tavernier from Oudenarde, who illuminated a multi-volume book called The Chronique and Conquête de Charlemagne, which is in the Brussels Library. But you have a fair idea about the trading and dealing which was going on that period. Of course, in 1465, when Memling became a citizen of Bruges, therefore had freshly moved there, it was still the period of the Burgundian dukes, Philip the Good and his son, the Count of Charolais, Charles the Bold, who managed to create, if you want to, a late medieval superpower between the Kingdom of France and the German Empire by acquiring huge territories connecting the Burgundian domains and the Netherlandish domains, and therefore getting a very, very powerful state indeed. Actually, the Burgundian Netherlands became the financial backbone of the Habsburg Empire under Charles V then. And Bruges, as the commercial center of the Burgundian Netherlands, was the main port and trading place, a place where countless merchant bankers from Italy had made and were making fortunes. The famous house ter Börse, the Borsa, the first stock exchange, was actually in Bruges, near to the Genovese Loge, a place which is unfortunately now the Museum of Pomfret. So these trading nations were multiple, and they had many people living in Bruges. So it was actually a very multicultural, if you want to, a multi-ethnic and prosperous city with a lot of money being dealt. And as a consequence, we have actually rather a lot of paintings of the 15th century from Bruges painters that were made for Italian patrons. I give you one example, which is a somewhat older contemporary of Memling, is a man called Petrus Christus, long wrongly believed to be a pupil of Van Eyck, who settled in Bruges in 1444 and died in 1472. He painted a Madonna and Child with Saint Jerome and Saint Francis, and two donors, which were probably Genovese donors. One of the coat of arms hasn't been identified. The other one is actually one of the Genovese Vivaldi family. The Genovese, of course, being traders in Alaun before the papal mines were discovered, were important there already in the 13th century, and actually many of the families settled there. One of the families that came from Genoa and settled in Bruges was the Adornes family, the family of the Adornes, who in the 15th century donated a huge church, the so-called Jerusalem Chapel, to the city, and we have actually records of their trading and pilgrimage activities. They were patrons of the art and important people to bring culture to Bruges. They collected a large library, had a public library program which was available to people in Bruges. And so, I mean, the whole idea of Italian immigration in the 15th, 14th century, in the 15th century is actually a large success story, much more than the Spanish at the same period. Next to the Genoese, of course, were the Venetians and Florentine nations, very particularly important there. We have Genoese merchant bankers in Bruges. We show here, which is of course a little bit of a different story, the portrait of presumably Bernardo Bembo, the Venetian ambassador to the court of Burgundy, who stayed in Bruges in the 1470s, and in all likelihood Memling painted his portrait. The coin of Emperor Nero is a coin that we know that Bernardo Bembo possessed. He had a manuscript made, which is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, illustrated version of Sueton's Lives of the Emperors, where the emperors' lives were illustrated with coins, and we know that one of the coins which is illustrated in that volume for Bernardo Bembo was this coin of Nero. The other portrait which we have in the exhibition as well, this is actually a cleaned illustration. For some strange reason, it seems to be impossible for publishers to get the cleaned version. Is a Venetian, is a Florentine merchant who must have been associated with the Medici, because he is portrayed by Memling here in a single portrait, but also in another portrait that has survived. We show you also in the show the Turin Passion, a peculiar painting that was identified as a commission by the vice manager of the Medici branch in Bruges until the 1466, Mr. Tommaso Portinari, of a very prominent Florentine family, and his wife Maria Baroncelli. This painting, probably made for the purpose of perpetual pilgrimage, ended up in the collection of the Medici and came from there to in the possession of the Savoy kings, and is now here, and then will be very soon going to the Galleria Sabauda again. And of course, if we talk about the Italian patrons of the art, we can't forget, of course, Van Eyck and the famous Arnolfini portrait in the National Gallery, allegedly depicting a member of the Arnolfini family, still sort of an enigmatic painting, once called the wedding portrait, then a betrothal, and lately has been identified as actually a posthumous portrait of the deceased wife of the donor, or the Marian triptych, a very small triptych from 1437, which was commissioned by one of the Giustiniani family member, very likely so, which is kept in the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden. Petrus Christus, the other contemporary of Bruges, was particularly successful in addressing the Spanish market. His wonderful Nativity of Christ, which is in the National Gallery in Washington, and has this kind of painted stone frame, was in all likelihood made for a Spanish donor, because it came from a Spanish possession. And the monumental Death of the Virgin, which is now in the Timken Museum of Art in San Diego in California, in all likelihood was actually made for Sicily. Again, at that point, of course, under Aragonese/Spanish rule. We might recall that there are several versions of the stigmatization of Saint Francis, one, the best one of them, being kept in the Galleria Sabauda in Turin, a painting that in all likelihood became available in Italy early on and inspired, in all likelihood, the baptism painting of Andrea del Verrocchio and Leonardo da Vinci in the Uffizi in Florence, but also a very strange, I show that here, very strange and rarely seen stigmatization of St. Francis from the circle of Colantonio. There, significantly, the head of the donor had been exchanged. If you look further to the Netherlands, of course, Rogier van der Weyden is another key figure in the exchange between the north and the south. His paintings are available in Italy, as witnessed by the wonderful Lamentation Entombment that we have here on show from the Uffizi, a painting that has long been attributed to the master himself, then has been considered to be a work by the young Memling, but it's probably a work that Rogier designed in collaboration with a couple of workshop members. Another painting which of course bears the coat of arms of the Medici and also has two of the Medici saints on it is the so-called Medici Madonna in Frankfurt. And I just have to remind you again on the influential composition of Jan van Eyck and his workshop of Saint Jerome that inspired, for example, Antonello de Messina's famous version of the subject that is now in London. Oops, wrong. This is not how I should be doing this. Let me try this. Yes. And of course, when we come to portraiture, again, we have to acknowledge probably more than Van Eyck, we should look at Petrus Christus. Petrus Christus is the first artist in the Low Countries who creates a sense of space in his portrait. So we have, I show you two examples here, the portrait of a Carthusian layman, which comes from Spain early on, and you see that here as well, in the portrait of a lady in Berlin on the other side, that there is an idea of an interior space with a shadow, etc., that exceeds what we have seen before in portraits by Jan van Eyck or Rogier van der Weyden, and it sort of leads the way towards the portraiture that Memling stands for. When Memling moved to Bruges, probably a little bit before, he seems to have been involved in a major commission by one of the most powerful people in the Burgundian Netherlands, by a man called Ferry du Cluny, who came from Burgundy and became Bishop of Tournai and also Chancellor of the Golden Fleece, an enormous powerful person who commissioned this a monumental triptych, probably for a family chapel in his hometown in the Franche-Comté. That has been long attributed to Rogier van der Weyden's workshop, but has been identified after the last restoration as a early work by Hans Memling. It comes from the Morgan collection and was one of the Morgan donations to the Metropolitan Museum in 1917. The composition is based on Rogier van der Weyden's famous Columba altarpiece, but it's yet a more ambitious, more complicated and more idiosyncratic representation that goes well and explains probably why Memling early on got all these important commissions. And I think if you go to the exhibition and you see the beautiful reconstructed Triptych of Jean-Brack from Vicenza, which of course is not so fantastically preserved, in the fabulous wings from the Metropolitan Museum, from the Morgan Library, which are the donor wings, then you get a sense of this extremely, of Memling's extreme care in preparing a composition, and it is almost paragone-like approach to show the world that he is there, he's out there. And I think if you look in the exhibition, you confront these wings with Rogier van der Weyden's Visitation, then you have a very keen sense that there is an ambitious young artist who really makes sure that the world realizes that he is one of the best painters of his generations. He shows off with every brushstroke there is, and he tries to convince his clients to give him money and to give him commissions and to secure his market space in Bruges. He secures his market space but remains in many ways very dependent on Rogier van der Weyden. I show you the body of Christ from the Vicenza triptych, as well as from the Altarpiece of the Seven Sacraments, a detail from that period. What aspect we are entirely trying to, or have avoided in the exhibition, is the whole aspect of technical studies, which Giovanni Villa will be talking about a little bit more next week. There is a triptych which has been commissioned by Alessandro Sforza, and it's traditionally attributed to the workshop of Van der Weyden. It has been argued that it might be actually also Memling in Van der Weyden's studio. I show you a picture of the underdrawing, and I confront that just so that you get a sense of how close the underdrawing style of Memling is. I confront that with a infrared reflectogram of the underdrawing of the Morgan painting. As you can see, it's very carefully conceived in brush, and this is also very typical for the great absentee of this exhibition, The Last Judgment, which I had the pleasure to examine somewhere in the early 90s. And I show you here a reflectogram that I made together with Molly Ferris then of one of the angels. But you see all the idea of very careful hatching in the folds is very clearly present. If we come to look at the triptych of The Last Judgment from Danziger, of course it has been seen many times that there is a great influence on Rogier van der Weyden's Last Judgment in Beaune. It has been argued by a British historian, Kenneth Brute Macfarlane, that actually The Last Judgment might have been commissioned by Rogier van der Weyden, which is of course impossible because we know that the donor, the Italian/Florentine banker Angelo Tani, commissioned it for a chapel that was only built after Rogier's death. But what we can see is that there are certain types that are actually repeated, but we see also very clearly again the influence of Stefan Lochner. I show you down below Memling's image a middle panel of A Last Judgment that has been painted by Stefan Lochner. This was wrong. And I just show you a couple of things which are of course very comparable, including the music-making angel, the flying angels with the coat of arms, Arma Christi, and a couple of details like, for example, these hellfires, which are far more subtly depicted in Rogier's version of the same theme. So what does Memling do? He kind of takes certain motives from Memling, from Rogier. He takes certain motives from Lochner. He takes ideas from Jan van Eyck, and he creates his own style, but in a very, very ambitious way. And if you look very carefully, then it is very clear that he must have had access in one way or the other to model drawings from the Van der Weyden workshop, because the way that, for example, specific fold lines like this are handled here are pretty much identically handled in the in both versions. But of course we have plenty of drawings that show that composition, one of them actually being signed and dated, signed by a German artist called Martin Schongauer, a drawing that was in the possession of Albrecht Dürer, and probably was done in the Netherlands, because there is still the open question that Schongauer went to the Netherlands and might have been working with Memling. But there is, for example, also another anonymous copy of that. So you know, these drawings were actually circulating, and the existence of like 2 of these drawings show that the figure of Christ from the bone altarpiece of Roger van der Weyden and or Memling's workshop were extremely popular and circulated a lot and were very important. And you have, of course, the unique opportunity to see here in this exhibition a little-known painting from Napoli that, in a way that is still entirely unclear to most of us, I think, including me, sort of like copies this wonderful figure of the grisaille of the Gdansk altarpiece, which of course never went to Italy because it always has been in Poland. So there is one of the little miracles that we might consider in the future, and maybe there will be a solution to identify the artist or get an idea how this motif was spread. I've mentioned that Memling was a very ambitious, and that he often referred to compositions by Roger van der Weyden, and the most obvious example thereof is the idea of the Epiphany triptych. There are 2 versions by Memling, one in the Prado, which I show you as a huge painting in the Prado, and one in the Memling Museum in Bruges, which I'll show you in a second. I would like to point out one aspect, I think, which helps you understand how conceptual Memling operates. And I show you the Nativity Scene and the Epiphany Scene. And I show you, and I just would like to indicate one particular aspect. And the aspect is the following. If you look at the Nativity, you have a view of the room which is roughly coming from that edge. So you have in the middle panel the central view, and in the side panel you have the back view. By that you are able to reconstruct the entire room. There's a 3-dimensional idea of the room, and for example you see the ox and the ass eating here, and you see them how the room, which we can only guess, actually works when seen from the side. So there is, or for example, how the back of this column is constructed, how the roof is constructed. There is a whole idea of a very complex spatial arrangement that is put into space. And Memling does the same thing, yet less obvious. This is 10 years later in the Florence triptych, where again the idea of having the front view and having a back view and having the idea that those views actually constitute a 3-dimensional space that you as a viewer can experience is there. And of course that harks back to a little pictorial, if you want to, pun that Roger van der Weyden made, who in his Columba altarpiece, of course, depicted the temple both from the outside and the inside. So you had the idea, okay, you had an idea in this particular picture that that you could see the inside and the outside at the same time, to have an idea about the building. And so Memling actually responds to that and tries to overdo it by just essentially, getting this extremely complex and ambitious paragone going. And I think, this is actually one of the things that you can see in the oeuvre of Memling a lot. There is always a extremely conceptual side to it. It's very well thought of, and there's always the little extra kick, I would call it, that that brings joy to the viewer. We have a little, it's probably one of the most beautiful yet also most smallest painting in the whole show. Is a small Christ as the Man of Sorrows from the Esztergom Museum. And just the particular way that Memling recreates a very common, a very well-known image that everyone at that period, every single one of his viewers knew so well that they, you know, I mean, that was like, I don't know, you know, one of the, like Andy Warhol's, I don't know, Marilyn Monroe. Everyone knows how it looks. So you have this Christ as a man of sorrow, and then Memling just slightly turns that figure out of his niche. And there is this light of this edge, literally this edge, where you can see that conventional iconography is sort of like transformed. The same happens actually again with his transformation of a Byzantine icon. Roger van der Weyden in the 1440s paints this enormously important triptych in the Louvre called the Triptych of Jean-Brack, and Memling sort of takes this Christ figure out there, and he sort of like transforms this Christ figure into an iconic image that he repeats several times. And I show you here a painting from the Pasadena Museum in California, and of course this most recent discovery of Memling in the stripped stage when it was in restoration, you know, almost perfectly preserved. This, I think, is something for many of the Italian viewers very unusual how well preserved these paintings actually are. And you see sort of like how this image is created. Once it's sort of like a portrait with a neutral background. One sort of the same situation is given with a slightly sort of different face in showing Christ in glory. But not only does it refer to Roger van der Weyden's Brack triptych, it also sort of like essentially harks back to portraits. And in that sense, if you just look the way the hand is constructed, and you go back, you look at the way that Memling puts this motif here, you find these kind of collaborations and congruences a lot. So the same hand model is used here in the religious connotations. It is also used in portraiture. One of the aspects that I think we have learned to appreciate is the particular manner of how Memling transformed the legacy of Roger van der Weyden and Jan van Eyck into a pictorial language that became prevalent in Bruges until the early 16th century. One of the great marvels of the Groninghen Museum in Bruges is the Jan van Eyck's Madonna of Joris van der Pale, an epitaph/altarpiece made between 1434 and 1436, a painting that in many ways recalls the idea of the Sacra Conversazione, well known from Italian paintings. Now this composition, which shows the enthroned Madonna and Child in a kind of apsis-like architecture interior with standing saints, is repeated in one of the most iconic compositions by Memling, the middle panel of his St. John altarpiece. Only that Memling kind of entirely erases the interior space, opens it up, and sort of like adds a landscape that also allows him to depict narrative issues. And then, of course, this composition is taken over and becomes like a hallmark of Memling. So the big version is the triptych of the two St. John's in Bruges, and then the image is transformed, and you have the same saints. I'm sorry, now I'm lost. You have the same saints in a smaller version of the same composition with a donor which actually belonged to Joshua, the English painter Joshua Reynolds at some point, and it's not by Jan van Eyck but by Memling, and it's not in the Groningen Museum but the Metropolitan Museum. But if you look very carefully, then you see that the fold lines that are created here are absolutely the same. So again, although the scale is different, we have a workshop that uses specific patterns, and Memling is probably one of the earliest examples of a very efficient use of pattern drawings that allows him to have a few basic compositions that he reproduces in many variations and always makes interesting twists and turns. If I continue to look at the specific manners in which Memling sort of creates or looks back at the pictorial traditions, then of course one needs to look at this very enigmatic Madonna and Child with a donor in St. Anthony in Ottawa, a painting that is dated 1472 on the frame, and of course that recreates the interior frame that we actually know from the Arnolfini wedding, with the idea of a window that opens up the space and gives light to the composition. But actually there is more to that. If you look very carefully, you see that he also refers to a very, very important composition that has been, for example, adopted by Petrus Christus. Is a very tiny painting, the so-called Exeter Madonna, a painting made in 1444 for a Carthusian abbot called Jan Voss, and shows Saint Barbara, the Carthusian abbot, and the Madonna and Child in an interior room in front of a landscape, which in turn harks back to a lost composition by Jan van Eyck, the so-called Malbeker Madonna, here a contemporary drawing of the 15th century that records that composition, and here I show you a 16th century copy of the painting. So this ambitious composition is also something that Memling recalls in his representation of the standing Madonna and Child plus the kneeling donor. And if you look very carefully, then you will realize that he, in the end, actually also looks back at the Rollin Madonna of Jan van Eyck in that way that he turns the Christ child once around. So he must have been aware of the compositional model there. He turns him around, and what you see here is sort of like, now he has his Benedictine arm is in the front, here is in the back. Here he holds the apple, here he holds the orb, and then look how the Christ child legs are arranged is exactly the opposite way. It's just one's turned around, and these are the little twists with which Memling, I think, must have greatly surprised and challenged his clients. One of the aspects that we are trying to address in the exhibition, and I think it's actually a beautiful section there, is portraiture. I think it's important to remember where we come from. I show you a couple of portraits from Roger van der Weyden, all very important, but yet also very stiff. I show you a drawing that has been attributed to van der Weyden, one of the very, very few portraits drawing of that period. And it gives you the sense of how these portraits were conceived. Just to add to that, I show you Jan van Eyck's portraits, who again is very, very good in sort of creating a three-dimensional face by using light in front of a black background, both in the London painting and the Vienna portrait of Jan de Leeuw. This is one of the intriguing features. And as I mentioned before, with Petrus Christus, you know, there is the addition of space into the portraiture, so it's not only in front of a black background, but it becomes part of a three-dimensional environment. And then there's Memling, who successfully actually puts it in plein air and puts the portrait in front of the landscape. And I must say, I haven't myself really realized that until this exhibition, that that this was far from evidence, and we can see that by the master of the Saint Ursula legend, who struggles in actually creating that kind of image. He always uses artificial backgrounds behind his sitters to avoid to place them directly for the landscape, as did Dirk Bouts in his important early portrait of 1462, where the interior is actually first opened to a landscape background by a window vista. Of course, the idea may or may not be very closely connected to the Brack triptych that I already mentioned, which of course shows a continuous background and places half-length figures in front of that. But still, sort of like, you know, Memling adds another quality, that he changes the perspective, he changes the focus, and creates an image that becomes very, very important in the whole course. There are different modes of portraits, and we tried to look at that very, very, very briefly here. There are portraits which function obviously in a different and more conservative environment. That is the case for the so-called portrait of Gilles Joie, a priest and composer who had his epitaph painted. Epitaph is now in Williamstown. And this might also be the case for the portrait of a lady of 1480, which is in the Hospital Museum in Bruges, of whose sister has made it miraculously to Rome. And then we have the great tradition of devotional triptychs and diptychs. One of the things which I think unfortunately we were aware of at the very outset is that it was impossible to recreate and reconstruct at the exhibition the devotional triptych of Benedetto Portinari. The reason of that is that the middle panel in Berlin, which had been cut down when it entered the collection of Solly in 1821, has a huge crack in the middle, so it is just considered to be too dangerous to move it, because the movement would have a very, very high chance of having massive paint losses along that crash. So we couldn't do that, but we have brought Mr. Portinari to the show. Another example of that kind is the portrait of a man from the Lehmann collection in New York, which has been, of course, discussed several times, has been shown before, and has this side background with a column, which is, of course, then quoted by Ghirlandaio. We also have the idea of a continuous landscape in this very important double portrait that was made by Memling, presumably for a German couple. One of the top pieces which are considered to be national treasure and are not supposed to leave the city of Bruges is the diptych of Martin von Nieuwenhove from 1487, which is, as you can see, very, very closely related in any kind to the Portinari diptych. But here you see that regardless of who the donor is, if he's Italian or not, Memling uses specific prototypes that he adopts, and we know from technical examinations, for example, that originally this Madonna was also set on a plain landscape, very much like this one, and only in the course of the composition it was changed to that. And of course, thereby foreshadowing the huge and very successful portraits of the 16th century, where, of course, still life elements become very, very important. We have to consider that, of course, portraits were popular, and that Memling sort of made a huge contribution to it. that his contribution in portraiture has to be seen in the line of portrait functions. But what is clear is that he takes the Rogerian prototypes and brings them into a modern space, and that is the great contribution of Memling in European art history. On the other hand, we also have to consider that one of the biggest paintings of the Netherlandish school, which are still extant in Italy today, is the Bordenary Altarpiece, commissioned by Tommaso Bordenary and now the Uffizi in Florence. And just imagine what would have happened and how people would have conceived the Last Judgment by Memling. Would it have not been captured by barbaric Polish, actually at that point still German, pirates and brought to Gdansk, where it literally doesn't have any followers. Just imagine what kind of impact that painting would have had on Renaissance Tuscany and Renaissance Florence, and you can probably see that if you consider how Ghirlandaio based his Sassetti Chapel on Hugo von der Goes' Bordenary Altarpiece. Thank you very much.